The finality of the act was in the sound the door made. It was not a slam of anger, but a dull, heavy thud of wood settling into its frame. A sound of conclusion. On the other side of that door was the home Ilara had known for 19 years. On her side, there was only the dusty street of Providence Gulch, a handful of coins in her palm, and a deed to a place everyone called the Folly. Mr. Graves had been polite, which was somehow worse than cruelty. He had stood in the parlor, his hat in his hands, explaining the terms of the debt. Her father, a man who could read stone and water better than he could read ledgers, had signed a note years ago for seed and equipment. He had intended to pay it off with a good season. But the seasons had been lean, and her father's lungs had filled with dust from the quarries he worked. Now, both the debt and the dust had claimed their due. "The law is the law, Ilara," Mr. Graves had said, his voice smooth as a polished river stone. He took the homestead, the tidy cabin her father had built, the quarter-acre of dark, tilled earth, the small barn with its scent of hay and memory. He left her with the only other property to her father's name, a worthless 40-acre plot in the High Plains desert, a piece of land taken in trade for a well that never drew water. He also gave her 10 silver dollars. "For your trouble," he'd said, as if her life were a minor inconvenience. The community watched. They were good people, mostly, but they were practical people. They saw a lone girl, an orphan, with nothing but a tragedy and a piece of useless paper. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, pulled her aside as she stood numbly in the street. His face was a mask of sincere pity. "Now, Ilara," he began, his tone that of a man explaining a simple sum, "you can't live out at the Folly. It's nothing but a sinkhole and sun-baked rock. Sell the deed to Graves for another $10. My wife needs help in the kitchen. You'll have a roof over your head, 3 meals a day. It's the sensible thing." She looked at his kind, reasonable face and saw a cage. A warm, safe cage, but a cage nonetheless. She thought of her father, his hands calloused and broken from wrestling a life from the earth. He had never been sensible. He had been strong. She shook her head, a small, firm gesture. The townspeople, clustered on the boardwalk, murmured amongst themselves. They saw stubbornness where there was only a desperate flicker of resolve. They saw a fool, a child, making a fatal error. They could not see the steel that was hardening in her spine. She walked away from Mr. Gable's sensible offer. She had what was left, the $10 from Graves, the deed, the clothes she wore, her father's heavy canvas sack of tools, and Silas, their old gray mule, who stood tethered to a post, watching her with patient, knowing eyes. She counted the coins. Not enough for a ticket east, not enough for a new life somewhere else. It was only enough for a beginning, or an end, right here. She made one stop. At the mercantile, she walked past the fabrics and canned goods, her eyes fixed on the items that mattered. She spent 7 of her $10, not on food, not on comfort, but on necessities her father had taught her to value above all else. A new handle for his pickaxe, a small sack of salt, a coil of good rope, a box of matches, and seeds, packets of beans, squash, and hardy greens that promised life if given half a chance. Mr. Gable rang up the sale, his expression a mixture of confusion and sorrow. He thought she was provisioning her own demise. With her last $3 in her pocket, she loaded the supplies onto Silas's worn leather harness, untied his rope, and turned her back on Providence Gulch. She did not look back at the cabin, with smoke already rising from its chimney, another family's smoke. She did not look at the faces in the windows, peering out at the orphan girl walking toward her inheritance of rock and ruin. She fixed her eyes on the distant, shimmering line of the high hills and walked. The mule, Silas, followed without protest, his hooves raising small puffs of dust that settled behind them like a closing curtain. The journey was a punishment. The trail that led from the relative green of the gulch climbed into an unforgiving world of stone and scrub. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her head and shoulders. The weight of the tool sack, slung over her shoulder, dug into her flesh, a constant, abrasive reminder of the work that lay ahead, or the work that would break her. Silas plodded on, his resilience a silent lesson. He knew this land. He knew that survival was a matter of placing one foot in front of the other, endlessly. By the second day, the isolation was complete. The world had been stripped down to three elements: the pale, merciless sky, the hot, fractured earth, and the quiet, rhythmic sound of her own breathing. She was an insignificant speck in a vast, indifferent landscape. The loneliness was a physical presence, as real as the thirst in her throat. She thought of the whispers in town, the pitying looks. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps this was not a journey toward a new life, but a slow march into oblivion. She found the property marker late in the afternoon, an iron stake driven into a fissure of granite, just as the deed described. She stood and looked out at her inheritance. It was worse than the stories. It was a landscape of failure. 40 acres of gray, shattered limestone, baked by a century of sun. A few skeletal junipers clung to life, their branches twisted into shapes of agony. And in the center of it all was the reason for its name, the folly. It was a massive sinkhole, a great circular wound in the earth, perhaps 100 feet across and 50 deep. The edges were a treacherous crumble of rock and dry soil. The bottom was lost in shadow, a dark, gaping mouth that seemed to have swallowed all hope. This was her home, a hole in the ground. A wave of despair so profound it buckled her knees, washed over her. She slid to the ground, the sharp rocks biting into her legs, and the tears she had held back since her father's death finally came. They were hot, bitter tears of grief, of rage, of utter hopelessness. The town was right. Mr. Gable was right. She was a fool. She had traded a warm kitchen for a grave. The silence of the place mocked her, amplifying the sound of her own ragged sobs. She was 19 years old, and her life was already over. She cried until she was empty, until there was nothing left but the burning in her throat and the grit of dust on her wet cheeks. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the cruel landscape in shades of orange and purple, a beauty that felt like an insult. Exhausted, she crawled toward the rim of the sinkhole, seeking the shade its edge offered from the last rays of the sun. She lay there, her face pressed against the cool stone, and felt something, a change in the air. On the surface, the evening air was still hot, radiating the day's heat back into the sky. But from the mouth of the sinkhole, there was a faint, steady exhalation of coolness. It was subtle, easily missed, but it was there. A breath of something different. Curiosity, the last ember of her spirit, began to glow. She sat up, her sorrow momentarily forgotten. She leaned over the edge, peering into the deepening shadows. The air rising from the bottom was distinctly cooler, and it carried a faint, clean smell, the smell of damp earth, a scent that had no right to exist in this desiccated place. Her heart began to beat faster, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She remembered her father's words, spoken years ago as he worked a well. "Water has its own voice, Ilara. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. And it has its own breath, always cooler." She scrambled back to Silas and uncoiled the new rope. Tying one end securely around the base of the largest juniper, she tossed the other into the abyss. Without a second thought, she gripped the rough fibers and began to lower herself down the steep, crumbling slope. Rocks skittered away from her feet, rattling into the darkness below. The air grew cooler with every foot she descended, a tangible relief against her sunburnt skin. She reached the bottom. It was a jumble of massive limestone boulders that had fallen from the rim over centuries. The ground was uneven, treacherous. The silence down here was different. It was a deep, resonant quiet, insulated from the world above. She stood perfectly still, straining her ears, listening past the pounding of her own blood. And then she heard it. Faint, almost imperceptible, a tiny, rhythmic tick, tick, tick. It was the sound of water dripping. She followed the sound, scrambling over the fallen rocks toward the far wall of the sinkhole. There, beneath a massive overhang of stone, was a dark fissure. The sound was coming from inside. Dropping to her knees, she began to dig with her bare hands, pulling away smaller rocks and loose soil. Her fingers were scraped raw, but she didn't feel the pain. She cleared an opening and pushed her hand into the cool, damp earth. Her fingers touched something wet. She pulled them out and saw they were slick with mud. She dug deeper, her movements frantic now. And then she felt it. A steady, cold trickle of water, emerging from a crack in the solid bedrock. It wasn't a gush, not a torrent, but a small, determined seep. Pure, clean, and impossibly cold. She cupped her hands and brought the water to her lips. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. It was life. In that moment, kneeling in the dark belly of the folly, Ilara knew the town was wrong. This was not a grave. It was a beginning. The despair was washed away by the slow, miraculous drip of water, and in its place, a grim, powerful resolve took root. She would build her life here, in this hole, from stone and water and her own 2 hands. The work began at dawn. The first task was a brutal exercise in leverage and endurance, clearing the floor of the sinkhole. The massive boulders that littered the bottom had to be moved. She used her father's iron pry bar, her entire body straining against the immense weight of the rock. She would find a purchase, throw her weight against the bar, and move a stone an inch, then another inch. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her hands, soft from a life of keeping house, were rubbed raw within the first hour. By noon, they were a mess of broken blisters and blood. She did not stop. She wrapped her hands in strips of cloth torn from her petticoat and kept working. Each stone moved was a small victory, a reclamation of space. She learned the physics of the work, how to use smaller rocks as fulcrums, how to roll a boulder instead of trying to lift it, how to listen to the groan of the stone, to know when it was about to shift. She worked until the sun disappeared from the sky above the rim, and then she would climb the rope, her body trembling with exhaustion, and collapse into a sleep so deep it was like a small death. As she cleared the floor, she began the second phase of her plan. She was not just moving rock, she was building. Using the techniques she had watched her father employ 1,000 times, she began to construct retaining walls against the unstable sides of the sinkhole. She chose flat, heavy stones for the base, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. She filled the gaps with smaller stones and packed them with a crude mortar made from clay she found near the spring and water. It was slow, agonizing work. Each stone had to be lifted, carried, and placed. The weight of them settled into her bones, making her feel ancient. Days blurred into a single, relentless cycle of labor. She rose with the sun, descended into her hole, worked until dusk, and climbed out again. Her world shrank to the circle of sky above and the growing order of the stone walls below. The soft girl who had left Providence Gulch was being chipped away, replaced by someone harder, leaner, stronger. her hands calloused over, the muscles in her back and arms corded into tight knots of strength. With a section of the floor cleared and one wall stabilized, she turned her attention to the spring itself. The seep was constant but slow. She needed a reservoir. Using her father's pickaxe and hammer, she began to attack the limestone floor where the water pooled. The sharp clang of steel on stone echoed in the enclosed space. She was carving a cistern, chipping away at the bedrock, inch by inch. Sparks flew in the dim light. Shards of rock stung her face. It was the hardest work of all, a fight against the very foundation of the earth. But with every chip of stone she removed, the pool grew deeper, the promise of stored water more real. Next came the shelter. On the most stable side of the sinkhole, protected by a deep overhang, she began to excavate. She dug into the limestone and clay wall, carving out a space for a dwelling. The rock itself would be 3 of her walls, the roof and the floor. This was her greatest advantage, the secret of the sinkhole. The earth itself would be her insulation, a massive thermal battery that would absorb the day's heat and bleed it back slowly through the night. And in winter, it would protect her from the freezing winds, holding a stable temperature. She built the front wall with the same care she had the retaining walls, using the best stones she had cleared. She left openings for a door and a small window. For wood, she felled 2 of the gnarled junipers on the surface. Getting the logs down into the sinkhole was a dangerous, difficult process, involving the rope, Silas, and a great deal of prayer. But she managed it. The logs became the beams for her small roof extension, and the material for a rough-hewn door that could be barred from the inside. One evening, as she was chiseling inside her new cave dwelling, her hammer struck a section of rock, and it gave way with a hollow sound. A cascade of loose shale poured out, revealing a dark, narrow fissure leading upward into the rock. A cool draft flowed out. She held a lit match to the opening, and the flame was pulled steadily upward. A natural chimney, a flue carved by millennia of water and time. It was another gift from the folly. She knew then exactly where her fireplace would go. After weeks of unceasing labor, she had the beginnings of a home, a stone room built into the earth, a cistern slowly filling with clear, cold water, terraced ledges supported by stone walls waiting for soil. It was time to return to Providence Gulch. She needed things she could not carve from stone or coax from the earth. She needed life. Her arrival in town caused a stir. The people who saw her hardly recognized her. Her face was tanned dark by the sun. Her clothes were stained and torn, and she walked with a new economy of motion, the walk of someone whose body was a tool accustomed to hard use. The whispers followed her as she led Silas, pulling the now empty cart, toward the mercantile. Mr. Gable's jaw dropped when he saw her. He had expected to hear she was dead or had come back begging. He did not expect this hard, determined woman who looked him squarely in the eye. "I need supplies," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She spent her last $3 with precision. She bought 2 laying hens, their frantic clucking a stark contrast to the grim silence of her work. She bought a tiny, squirming piglet. And she bought more seeds, corn, potatoes, and winter wheat. Mr. Gable tallied the cost, his face a canvas of disbelief. "Elara," he said, leaning over the counter, his voice low, "what is a girl living in a hole in the ground going to do with a pig?" "Fatten it," she replied, counting out the last of her coins. As she was loading the screeching piglet and the cackling hens into a crate on the cart, Brant, the town's most successful hunter, sauntered over. He was a big man, full of easy confidence and casual cruelty. He looked at her meager livestock and let out a booming laugh. "Gonna raise that hog on rocks, are you, Ilara?" he called out, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Or maybe you'll feed it your own foolish pride." A few people laughed with him. Ilara did not look at him. She finished securing the crate, gave a gentle click of her tongue to Silas, and led her small, noisy caravan out of town. The laughter followed her for a block, then faded. The nickname they had given her in her absence now had a shape and a sound. Ilara's Folly. The girl in the hole. The journey back was slower, burdened by the animals. The mule, Silas, was her silent, steadfast partner. He pulled the cart without complaint, his presence a comforting weight against the world's scorn. The chickens and the pig were more than just animals, they were a promise. They were the beginning of a system, a cycle of life she intended to nurture in the sterile belly of the rock. They were her companions in her solitary kingdom. The nickname followed her, an invisible specter that clung to her land. Ilara's Folly, they called it now, no longer just the Folly. The name was spoken with a shake of the head in the mercantile, with a titter of gossip after Sunday service. It became a piece of local folklore, the story of the stubborn orphan girl who chose to live in a hole rather than accept charity. She was a cautionary tale, a symbol of pride laid low. Brant, the hunter, made a point of riding by her property a month later. He didn't come down. He simply sat on his horse at the rim of the sinkhole, a silhouette against the harsh blue sky. He looked down into the crater where she was painstakingly hauling buckets of soil from the surface to fill her terraced garden beds. He watched her for a long time, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a fine grave you're digging, Ilara," he shouted down, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "A fine grave." He laughed, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away. Ilara didn't look up. She didn't waste the energy. She simply emptied her bucket of precious soil onto the waiting terrace and went back for another. His mockery was just noise, a sound from a world that no longer mattered. Her world was here, within these stone walls, governed by the rhythms of work and the slow, steady drip of the spring. Autumn deepened into winter. The winds that swept across the high plains became razor-sharp, carrying the first hints of ice. The people of Providence Gulch sealed their windows, stacked their firewood high, and settled in for the long, cold dark. They imagined Ilara freezing in her damp pit, regretting her foolish choice. But in the sinkhole, a different reality took hold. The howling wind screamed across the surface, unable to penetrate the deep shelter. The tons of limestone that surrounded her dwelling, cooled by the fall, now held a steady, cool temperature. But it was a temperature far warmer than the brutal cold outside. Her small, efficient fireplace needed only a handful of juniper branches to fill the stone room with a deep, radiant warmth. The thermal mass of the rock absorbed the heat and held it, creating a pocket of enduring comfort. Her days fell into a quiet, monastic routine. At dawn, she would feed the chickens and the pig, who were housed in a small, dry dugout she had carved next to her own. Their body heat added to the warmth of the subterranean space. She would check her water level in the cistern, a pool of black, still glass. She would tend the small, experimental patch of winter greens she had planted in the lowest terrace, which, shielded from the worst of the frost and nourished by the constant humidity, were actually growing. She spent the long, dark evenings by the fire, mending her clothes, sharpening her father's tools, or simply watching the flames dance. The solitude was immense, a vast ocean of quiet. But it was not loneliness. She was the sovereign of this small, ordered world. Everything in it, every stone, every drop of water, every living creature was there because she had willed it to be. She was not just surviving, she was presiding. Before the deep snows came, a smaller test arrived. A week of unseasonable, torrential rain swept through the region. On the surface, it was a deluge, turning the dry creek beds into raging torrents. For Ilara, it was a terrifying trial. Water poured over the rim of the sinkhole in muddy cataracts. Her carefully constructed world was in danger of being washed away. She worked for 2 days straight in the driving rain with her shovel and pickaxe. She was soaked to the bone, chilled and exhausted, but she fought back. She dug new diversion channels, reinforcing them with stone, guiding the destructive flow of water away from her dwelling and her garden terraces, directing it toward a natural drainage fissure on the far side of the sinkhole. When the rain finally stopped, she was covered in mud and trembling with fatigue. But her home was dry. Her gardens were intact. She had held back the flood. She had learned a new weakness in her system and had made it a strength. The spring of 1893 arrived not with gentle rains and green shoots, but with a dry, persistent wind that stole the moisture from the soil. The sun, which should have been a welcome friend, felt like an enemy from the first day of May. It rose early, white-hot in a cloudless sky, and baked the earth until dusk. By June, the talk in Providence Gulch was of drought. The creek that ran through town, usually a boisterous rush of snowmelt, had dwindled to a sluggish brown trickle. The farmers watched their newly planted crops wither before they had a chance to grow. By July, the creek was gone, leaving behind a cracked, stony scar. The town's confidence, rooted in its deep, reliable well in the central square, began to fray. The well had never failed. It was the heart of the community, the source of their shared life. But now, the bucket came up only half full. Then, a quarter full. The water that remained was thick with silt. Panic, a low, quiet hum at first, began to grow louder. Mr. Graves, whose large ranch bordered the town, had his own deep well, drilled at great expense. He used a steam pump to water his vast herds of cattle. A delegation from the town council, led by Mr. Gable, went to him to ask for help, to beg for shared water. Graves refused. "I have my own stock to think of," he said, his arms crossed over his chest. "Every bucket I give you is a bucket I take from my own profits. The town well is the town's problem." His words were a death sentence delivered with the cold logic of a balance sheet. The community that had cast Ilara out for her supposed foolishness now found itself abandoned by its wealthiest and most sensible member. The town began to break down. The meticulously tended gardens behind the houses turned to dust. The leaves on the cottonwood trees yellowed and fell, as if it were autumn. The sound of a hammer was replaced by the lowing of thirsty cattle, a desperate, mournful sound that haunted the hot, still air. The town well went completely dry on the first Monday in August. The rope came up with nothing but a hollow, echoing clatter as the bucket hit the bottom. The heart of Providence Gulch had stopped beating. Down in Ilara's Folly, the world was different. The searing sun could not reach the bottom of the sinkhole for more than a few hours a day. The air, cooled by the stone and humidified by the spring, remained temperate. While the world above turned brown and brittle, her terraced gardens were a vibrant, shocking green. The leaves of her bean and squash plants were broad and healthy. Her spring, the source of it all, had slowed. The steady drip had become a patient, hesitant plink, but it had not stopped. The water level in her cistern had dropped, but it was still there, a deep, precious reserve of cool, clear life. She rationed with painstaking care. Every drop was measured, used first for drinking, then for the animals, and finally ladled carefully onto the roots of her plants. She was living on a knife's edge, but she was living. The contrast was absolute. Above, a world dying of thirst. Below, her small, secret circle of persistence. One blistering afternoon, a shadow fell across the garden bed she was tending. She looked up from the soil and saw a figure standing at the rim of the sinkhole, wavering in the heat haze. It was a woman, clutching a small bundle. As the figure stumbled closer, Ilara recognized her. It was Mr. Gable's wife, Mary. Her dress was coated in dust, her face a mask of cracked dirt and desperation. She looked down into the sinkhole, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and shame. She had come here as a last resort, chasing a rumor, a piece of old mockery that had taken on the shape of a desperate hope. "Ilara," she called down, her voice a dry croak. "They said, the children's stories, they said you had water." She swayed on her feet, the bundle in her arms, stirring weakly. It was her youngest son. "He has the fever," Mary Gable cried, her voice breaking. "There's no clean water, not a drop in the whole town. I didn't know where else to go." The shame was heavy in her voice. She was begging for help from the Folly Girl, the object of her husband's pity and the town's scorn. Ilara looked up at the woman outlined against the unforgiving sky. She thought of Mr. Gable's sensible advice, of Brant's laughter, of the whispers that had followed her out of town. A bitter, satisfying refusal rose in her throat. It would be so easy to say no. It would be justice. Then she looked at the small, still bundle in the woman's arms. She looked at the mother's terrified eyes, and she knew that justice had nothing to do with it. The systems she had built, the water she had so carefully guarded, what was it all for, if not for this? To hoard life in the face of death was its own kind of failure. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an inevitability. Without a word, she walked to her cistern, lowered the bucket, and pulled it up, hand over hand, full to the brim with clear, cold water. She carried it to the base of the rope. "I'll send it up," she called. Then she paused. "Bring him down here. It's cooler. The air is better for his fever." She was not just offering water. She was offering sanctuary. She tied the bucket to the rope and watched as Mary Gable, her face streaming with tears of gratitude and shame, hauled it up. An hour later they came. Mr. Gable, his face grim and humbled, helped his wife bring their sick child down the rope. When his feet touched the floor of the sinkhole, he stopped and stared. His mind, which had held a firm image of a dark, muddy pit, could not process what he was seeing. He saw a clean, orderly space, paved with flat stones. He saw walls of masterful, dry-stack masonry holding back the earth. He saw a small, sturdy home built into the rock, a thin tendril of smoke rising from a chimney he couldn't see. His gaze fell upon the garden terraces, a riot of impossible green, lush with beans, squash, and corn. He saw healthy chickens scratching in a pen, and a fat pig sleeping in the shade. The air was cool and moist, a shocking relief after the furnace above. And he saw the cistern, a deep, stone-lined pool of water so clear he could see the bottom. He looked at Ilara, this young woman his own age, her hands calloused, her face serious, and he felt a wave of shame so profound it almost brought him to his knees. He had offered her a servant's life out of pity. She had built a kingdom. He started, his voice failing him. "We didn't know." Ilara simply nodded and led them into her dwelling. Inside, it was even cooler. She gave the boy a cup of water and bathed his forehead with a cool, damp cloth. The child, who had been listless and weak, drank greedily, and his breathing seemed to ease in the gentle air. By the next morning, word had spread through the desperate town. They came in a trickle at first, then a stream, a silent, grim procession of her neighbors, the people who had mocked her and pitied her, now stood at the rim of her folly, carrying empty buckets and empty hopes. Brant, the hunter, was among them. He did not ask for anything. He simply stood at the edge, looking down at her creation. His eyes, so accustomed to reading the secrets of the wilderness, traced the lines of her walls, the design of her water channels, the logic of her terraced gardens. He saw the genius of it, the sheer, brutal force of will that had been required to build it. He saw not a grave, but an ark. He met Elara's gaze across the distance. He cleared his throat, and his voice, when it came, was rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "We called it Elara's folly," he said, his words carrying down into the quiet space. The whole town fell silent to listen. "My God," he breathed, shaking his head slowly. "We were the fools." It was the admission the entire town felt, but had not dared to speak. It hung in the air, a confession and an apology. Elara's response was not in words. She did not offer forgiveness or recrimination. She offered instructions. She emerged from her dwelling and organized them. She established a line. She explained the rationing. 1 bucket per family, per day, for drinking and cooking only. No more. She showed them how to draw the water without disturbing the silt, how to conserve every drop. Her quiet, commanding grace was more powerful than any speech. In her, they saw not a triumphant victim, but a leader. She was not gloating. She was simply doing what needed to be done. She was sharing the life she had fought so hard to create, because that was the only choice her character would allow. She was saving them from their own short-sightedness, and she did it with the simple, profound dignity of a bucket of clean water. The drought held for another 3 weeks. Every day, the people of Providence Gulch made the pilgrimage to the sinkhole, their belief in Elara growing with every bucket of water she provided. Her folly had become their lifeline. They saw her animals thriving, her garden producing food, and they understood that her systems were more resilient than anything they had built. They had built on the surface, trusting in the sky. She had built into the earth, trusting in stone and her own strength. When the drought finally broke, it came with a storm of biblical proportions. The rain fell for 2 days, and the sound of the creek returning to its bed was a sound of resurrection. The town had survived. It had been humbled, scarred, but it would endure, and it owed its life to the girl it had dismissed. In the aftermath, the town's relationship with Elara was irrevocably transformed. The name Elara's Folly was never spoken again. In its place, a new name emerged, whispered with reverence: the Spring of Providence. Her land, once worthless, was now seen as the most valuable in the county. Mr. Graves, who had hoarded his water while the town withered, became a pariah. His greed was a stain that could not be washed away. Children fell silent when he passed in the street. Business in town was refused to him. Within a year, he sold his ranch for a fraction of its worth and moved away. His legacy one of selfishness in the face of shared disaster. Mr. Gable came to her, his hat in his hands, just as Mr. Graves once had. But his purpose was different. "Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "anything you need from my store, for the rest of your life, it's yours. No charge." Elara considered his offer. She looked at his humbled, earnest face. "Thank you, Mr. Gable," she said, "but I will pay. Just give me a fair price on seeds and good steel for my tools. That's all I ask." She would accept no charity. She had earned her place, and she would maintain it on her own terms. The Great Drought of 1893 became the defining event in the history of Providence Gulch. It taught the community a hard lesson about resilience, about the hidden value in things and people they had once discarded. They started to learn from Elara's methods. New homes were built with stone foundations to moderate the temperature. Nearly every family dug a cistern to capture rainwater. They began to look at the earth not just as something to be plowed on the surface, but as a source of shelter and stability. Ilara's home became a local landmark. Travelers were often directed to see the marvel of the sunken gardens, the place where one woman had built an oasis in the desert. Her story was told and retold, spreading to other towns, becoming a frontier legend, a testament to what a single, determined person could build when left with nothing but rock, will, and a secret spring. Years passed. Ilara never left her sinkhole. She expanded her gardens, her flock of chickens, her knowledge of the land. She never married, but she was never alone. The community she had saved became her family, seeking her out not for water, but for wisdom. She taught them how to read the stone, how to find clay, how to build to last. The story closes on Ilara as an old woman. Her hair is the color of silver, her face a map of sun and time, but her eyes are as clear as the water in her cistern. She sits on a stone bench at the rim of her home, which is no longer a stark crater, but a lush, green amphitheater, overflowing with vines, fruit trees, and life. She looks out at the setting sun, painting the high plains, the same unforgiving landscape she had once faced with despair. But she no longer sees a wasteland. She sees a place of profound and hidden beauty. She had not conquered it. She had learned to listen to it, to work with it, to find its secret heart. She had been given a worthless plot of land and a legacy of scorn. From them, she had built not just a shelter, but a world. And in doing so, she had proven that the most valuable things are never the ones that are easily seen, but are those one must have the courage to dig for.